Live Curious, 내셔널 지오그래픽 채널.
In 1950, at the start of the Korean War, Russian and American fighters clashed over Korea in the fastest dogfights ever seen. This was the world's first jet war. 33 American and British pilots who were shot down are still missing in mysterious circumstances. Their bodies have never been found. No one knows if they're dead or alive. There are even rumors some were taken to gulags deep in the Soviet Union.
Would they have taken Americans? Absolutely. It was something that the public was not aware of. It was not publicized. Why? We didn't want to have World War III.
Today, investigators are scouring the prison camp records in search of clues. The families of the missing are desperate to know the truth.
You could just imagine what he had gone through. Geez, was he possibly even still alive?
For 50 years, the Korean conflict has been known as the Forgotten War. But now, the story of the men who went missing can finally be told. For the young pilots sent to war, Korea was a barren and foreboding place.
When I stepped off the airplane just at the crack of dawn at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I took a whiff of the air, it was the worst smelling place I had ever been, and my first thought was, my God, I'm going to die in this place.
It was cold, and it was wintertime, and typical Korean with mud and gray and ugly looking. There was war going on, and it sounded like that's where a fighter pilot would like to be, to see what that jet-propelled war was like.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, act.
These pilots were about to take part in a new kind of air war. They would fight at over 600 miles per hour, but had little idea of the hidden dangers of combat over Korea. The war started in the summer of 1950, when communist forces from the north invaded the south. The United States led a UN ground force to repel the invasion and pushed the communists back into North Korea. But then, in the autumn, hundreds of thousands of Chinese reinforcements came streaming over the border into Korea to support their comrades in arms. Outnumbered on the ground, the UN's hopes turned to the sky and the United States Air Force.
Anybody got any questions? Okay, let's go get them.
They went into action without delay, striking at military targets, with special attention to the enemy's lines of communication and supply.
American bombers struck at bridges across the Yalu River that forms the border between China and Korea. It was across this river that crucial supplies for the Communist Army came into the country.
Now those aircraft, they were able to operate essentially unopposed. There was no Korean air defense, there was no North Korean air forces. And that's the way it was. It was a happy time for them almost, until the MiG-15s appeared.
When this sleek silver jet came swooping into Korea, it was the fastest plane in the sky. This Russian-built fighter took everyone by surprise. In response, the United States sent for its own fighter, the Sabre, the only plane in the world that could take on the MiG. The two planes looked strikingly similar.
In fact, when the first MiG attacks happened, the pilots called back and they said, we're being attacked by Sabres, we're being attacked by our own side. the MiG-15s that were fast, they were very heavily armed, they'd climb quickly, they could slice through the American formations and be gone again, almost before the pilots knew what had happened.
The MiG and the Sabre clashed for the first time in a narrow strip of airspace along the Chinese and Korean border. It became known as Mig Alley. Mig Alley followed the route of the Yalu River. Fenced in by mountains and frequently hung with cloud, it was a perilous place to fly, especially at speeds of 500 miles an hour.
I'll never forget, my flight leader was physically shooting at a MiG when another MiG came in on me, and that was the first time I'd been shot at. He had about 12 foot of flames coming out of that 37 millimeter cannon, and I saw the red balls going by. The rule that we were taught was you don't dogfight with them when they have the advantage. You just go ahead and dive and lose them.
And you lost him?
So we lost him, yeah.
The West was always suspicious about the extent of the Soviet Union's involvement in Korea. The Soviets had supplied hundreds of their best fighter jets to the North Koreans, but the Soviets were keen to play down any further role in Korea. They feared this Cold War conflict might escalate into full-scale nuclear war. Yet the temptation to see their MiGs in action against America was irresistible.
The Russian motivation was quite straightforward. They wanted to test their aircraft, and the best testing ground there is war. They had a new aircraft. They needed to know how they were going to perform against their former American allies, who they knew now would be their future opponents.
In battle, pilots found it hard to tell the MiG and the Sabre apart. The reason for their striking resemblance lay in Nazi Germany. At the end of the Second World War, both the Soviet Union and America studied captured German technology, including the Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational fighter jet.
They recognized it had two really important developments. One of them was the axial flow jet engine, which promised to be the engine of the future, and the second was the swept wing.
It completely changed their thinking about aircraft design. It revolutionized their ideas of aircraft design.
Straight wings work well on propeller-driven planes, which operate at relatively low speeds. But at the high speeds possible with a jet engine, straight wings encounter aerodynamic problems. Shock waves form around the wing, causing drag.
But if you use a swept wing and a swept tail, all of a sudden you have a much more sleeker, much more efficient aerodynamic design that lets you move at much higher speeds.
The United States and the Soviets both used wing designs from Germany in the Sabre and the MiG, but the Soviets looked elsewhere for the MiG's remarkable engine.
The MiG was a good, well-armed aircraft, but what made it great was its engine. And the reason it was great is because it was a great British engine. And the reason that there was a British engine there is because Britain gave it to them. In 1946, the British government, as a gesture of friendship to a wartime ally, gave permission to Rolls-Royce to send a batch of Neen engines to the Soviet Union. Now, the Neen was the most powerful jet engine of its day. Rolls-Royce were the undisputed leaders in jet engine technology at the time. But the sad irony of this is that just a few years later, when the Korean War broke out, Allied pilots, British pilots, found themselves being shot at by an aircraft powered by a British engine.
21 British pilots flew fighters in Korea. 3 went missing, and it's not clear whether they were killed or captured. Some believe there's a small chance they could still be alive. Among the missing is Wing Commander John Baldwin, a legendary World War II ace with 16 kills to his name. In March 1952, he disappeared on a reconnaissance mission. Today, his son Michael is determined to find out what happened to him.
This is a comic, Victor, that was printed in 1963. There was a series of these things about famous people in the Second World War, and this one's about our father. I would have been 15 at the time, and my brother's about 11. So this was quite fun for us to get. He was called Typhoon Johnny in this, although I don't think he was ever called Typhoon Johnny by anybody else. There are certain specific episodes that I can remember, like I remember him kissing me goodbye. That was the first thing. I remember him giving me a good beating because I threw a stone through a window.
As long as there's doubt about his father's fate, Michael refuses to give up hope. He keeps a scrapbook of news clippings which offer tantalizing clues about what happened to his father.
There was always one particular cutting, which is in front of me now, which even when I was quite young, it's the thing that made me wonder. When I was in my teens and 20s, I often used to read this, and it did make me wonder what had happened to him. And it says the tales that told of an almost unrecognizable prisoner in a North Korean compound who was said to be Baldwin. I mean, if he was still alive, that would be amazing, but that is possible. He could still be alive now as we speak. That kind of thing makes you want to establish the truth.
Michael has grown up not knowing how or even if his father died. Was he captured, as the article suggests? To uncover the truth, Michael needs to embark on a painful journey. John Baldwin was one of the most senior pilots to be sent to Korea. He led a small team of British volunteers who flew alongside the cream of the United States Air Force. Many were heroes from the Second World War.
Our job is to patrol Mig Alley and keep the MiGs off the backs of the fighter bombers when they're up there dropping their bombs on targets in that area. It's an interesting job. We like it a lot. Yesterday I finally got my 5th MiG.
Some went on to be astronauts, and one, Lieutenant Buzz Aldrin, became a superhero as the second man to walk on the moon.
I do, however, remember my 37th mission rather vividly. That was the mission I got my first MiG destroyed.
In contrast, the North Korean Air Force had never flown jets before. Ken Rowe was one of the first North Korean pilots to learn to fly a MiG.
We were not adequately trained. After we learned how to take off and landing, they didn't teach us how to fly fast. They needed a jet pilot in my class. And then they taught us how to fly a formation flight. I was excited by flying the MiG and going up to the 50,000 feet. But whenever I get chased by the American plane, then that was not much fun.
But within a year, American Sabres were being shot down too, and the fate of some pilots remains a mystery. Any captured Sabre pilot could provide valuable intelligence on America's most advanced fighter jet, if he was taken alive. Dan Blasser is a senior analyst with the United States government, and he has spent 13 years on the trail of these missing British and American men.
My job is like doing a million-piece jigsaw puzzle, where I have no picture to go from, and I have to find the pieces to the jigsaw puzzle which are scattered around the world. There were 31 F-86 pilots whose circumstances of loss led us to believe they may have survived the shoot-down of their plane.
Danny Cope's father, Troy, is one of the 31 American Sabre pilots missing in action. He is determined to find out what happened to his father.
I remember seeing in a telegram from the military to my Uncle Laurel that my dad was missing in action, and it was pretty cryptic. I mean, just a few lines on a telegram. My older brother, Johnny, was 4, and I was 2, and my younger brother, Mike, was just 8 months, 9 months old. So we spent much of our childhood not knowing much about my dad.
Captain Troy Cope went missing on September the 16th, 1952, when his Sabre was ambushed by MiGs. He lost contact with his wingman and disappeared.
It is with deep regret that I officially inform you that your husband, Captain Troy G. Cope, has been missing since 16 September 1952 as a result of participating in Korean operations.
Danny's father was shot down in one of the most dangerous parts of Mig Alley, just across the border in China. And it was from China that Dan's Blasser got his first lead in the hunt for Captain Troy Cope.
In the mid-1990s, an American businessman traveled to Andong, China, and he went to the museum there. He came across 3 sets of American dog tags that were on display there. One of them was for Troy Cope. Somebody went down to verify this, and lo and behold, they wore Captain Cope's dog tags.
When I heard about the dog tags being discovered, then of course I immediately, because of his name being on the POW list, and then was that because then he was captured and was really a POW, or was it because these were taken from a crash site?
When Troy Cope was shot down, Mig Alley was becoming an increasingly dangerous place for Sabres. Against the novice MiG pilots, it should have been easy for the United States to win the air war. But less than a year into the conflict, the MiG pilots went through a mysterious transformation. Their new tactics were daring and aggressive. What had triggered this dramatic improvement in their flying skills? It wasn't long before the truth emerged.
I had a friend that was over there fighting, and he shot at a MiG, and the MiG pilot bailed out, and when he was down, he was floating in his parachute, and my friend went by him in his airplane, and the guy was coming down with a red beard, shook his fist at my guys who went by, so it was obviously that he was Caucasian. So I got permission to go to one of our heavy radar sites. There was a transmission coming that was being relayed to us from people that spoke Russian and could hear the Russian transmissions from north in Manchuria. So we were obviously involved with Russian combat pilots.
They now knew what they already suspected. Russian pilots were flying MiGs, and it would change the course of the war.
The impact of the Soviet pilots was immense because, of course, they were far better trained, far more experienced, and far more enthusiastic pilots than the North Koreans. The Russians were simply in a different league.
For 40 years, the Soviets' role in Korea remained a secret. Only now are their pilots able to acknowledge their covert presence in this war. Sergei Kramarenko secretly flew in Korea and became one of its top aces.
It was a secret mission. Neither before nor after the war were we allowed to reveal that we were going to fly for the North Koreans against the Americans. It was top secret. We were told that in case we were shot down beyond the front line, we had to kill ourselves. Not to surrender was in the interest of the state, of keeping the military secret.
If the secret got out, the Russians feared the Korean conflict might trigger World War III. The Americans had similar fears. So although they knew about the Russian pilots, they never publicly acknowledged it. Both sides kept the secret. Colonel Orlov was a Soviet intelligence officer in North Korea.
It was kept from the American public in case they demanded action against the Soviet Union. By this time, Russia had the atomic bomb, and neither Washington nor Moscow wanted to risk full-scale nuclear war.
It was a dangerous game, but the Soviets had other motives for sending their pilots to Korea.
They relished the chance to take their new aircraft and go up against the Americans and their jets, which they saw as the best opposition in the world, but also an opposition that they could beat.
The Soviets and the United Nations employed very different tactics in the battle for air superiority.
The tactical formation of Sabres was based around the leader and the wingman. Basically, the leader and the wingman operating off his wing as an extra pair of eyes to look out and protect the leader while the leader engages in combat against the foe. If we put another element with that, now we have the finger four. We have a group of four. What this meant was that we had a very fluid formation here that, if bounced, could break into two elements of two, and you would still not break that inviolate bond between the leader and the wingman as they prosecute air combat against the foe.
American pilots had to make their own decisions in combat, but the Soviets were directed from bases on the ground, known as ground control intercepts.
Ground control interception officers would position the MiGs so that they would fly across the Yalu at very high altitude and high speed, just at the point where Sabre pilots, having made a routine patrol, were getting very low on fuel. The MiGs would dive down on the Sabres from high altitude, make a single pass through their formation, and then blast back toward the Yalu to try to get into North Korea again before the Sabres could follow after them.
If there were no MiGs flying, we'd patrol up and down the Yalu River, and then, as we called bingo, meaning minimum fuel to get back home, we'd turn to leave, and the MiGs sometimes would come up and then try to engage us when we were leaving. And so the 200 miles to the Yalu River was a tactically bad thing from our standpoint.
The Russians were soon scoring a high number of kills.
I didn't worry about death as much as I did getting captured.
The fear of being shot down was bad enough, but ending your days in a Russian gulag seemed even worse. Yet it still didn't deter some foolhardy acts of bravado.
Biggest dumb thing I ever did in my life. In an effort to try and entice the MiGs to come down and do battle with us, we decided we would try to drop bombs so they'd have to come in and look at us. We dropped our bombs, and I circled to see if we were accurate. And in doing so, I saw a truck going down the highway. So I thought I'll just go by and shoot that truck up, and I have a good story to tell the guys at the bar tonight when I get home. And so I slowed down, opened the speed brakes, and got ready to shoot at it just as it turned off of the highway into a forest. And I couldn't turn sharp enough to go over and get it, but in doing the slowdown, I got hit by ground fire. My cockpit filled with smoke. Had to fly over another heavily defended town and got hit another couple of times. I have a fire warning light in the front compartment and fire warning in the aft compartment, and I know that I don't have enough power to keep on flying, and I'm going to end up by flying into the ground, which of course I did.
Bud survived his shoot-down, but was captured. As a senior officer and Air Force tactician, he was a valuable prize for the enemy.
I was kept in solitary confinement all the time I was in prison. I got interrogated almost continuously. It was the kind of thing you see on TV, where there'd be 4 or 5 guys sitting at a table and they would start to ask me questions. For example, how many F-86s are there in South Korea? That kind of stuff. They were using what we call brainwashing, Pavlov reflex conditioning, trying to break me down so I'd tell them anything just to get away.
내셔널 지오그래픽 채널.
I made a confession. It was not a confession that had any basis.
After enduring interrogation and brainwashing for 16 months, Bud was released and sent home. Others were not so lucky. It's cases like Bud's that give hope to the families of other missing pilots. Michael Baldwin has flown from London to Canada to pursue a promising lead. He thinks it may prove his father was also a prisoner of war.
Michael, so nice to meet you after all this time.
He's received a letter from Andy Mackenzie, a Canadian Sabre pilot who spent 2 years as a POW in North Korea, and there heard news of Michael's father.
It's getting bigger and bigger, this...
We've got a file on you, too.
Oh, my God.
The Baldwin file.
Really?
Yeah.
In your letter here, you say you were visited by a young Korean who spoke good English, said he was a North Korean fighter pilot. What, do you know, can you put any more light on what sort of guy this chap was?
Yeah, he was about 25 years old.
Yeah.
Spoke excellent English, and he was the only visitor that I ever had when I was in solitary. And he came in and he just blurted out, that's the only conversation we had, is, we have Wing Commander Baldwin. So that struck me that I would be meeting Wing Commander Baldwin later on because he was a POW.
Yes.
He seemed to be bragging about having your father. And he immediately left after he told me that.
Michael has one more lead he wants to check. After his release, Mackenzie gave an intelligence debriefing to British agents in Hong Kong.
This is a summary of what you said to the people in Hong Kong, according to the people in Hong Kong. And it reads, when questioned here on British POWs, he was, that's you, he was categoric in stating he'd seen no British POWs. He had heard only of Wing Commander Baldwin, RAF, who he was informed was dead.
That's not correct.
And that's not correct.
No, I've never heard from anybody that he was dead.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and everybody else had said, well, he probably died in the crash and that's that. Well, suddenly it was quite a bolt to hear this story. It's quite something.
Andy Mackenzie was released over a year after the war's end. But intelligence reports suggested there could be a more sinister reason why some pilots, like John Baldwin, never came home.
There was an air attaché in Hong Kong by the name of Delk Simpson who sent a report out saying that there were trainloads of American prisoners of war being transshipped through China to the former Soviet Union.
Such reports fueled the rumors surrounding the fate of the missing Sabre pilots. Was it possible some were spirited to the Soviet Union? And could Michael's father have been among them? Michael DeArmond is one of the few captured pilots who was interrogated by a Russian and lived to tell the tale.
One day when I went for interrogation, there was a Caucasian officer in a Korean uniform but with no rank on him. I turned to the captain and I said, "Who's this?" And he said, "This is one of our Russian advisors who would like the answers to a few questions." I became more and more concerned about the purpose of this Russian running my interrogation, because one of my frankly deepest fears was to wind up in a gulag someplace. So I tried to be the dumbest F-86 pilot he had ever interrogated. Apparently it was effective, but he became more and more exasperated until one day he said something to the Korean major, again the slapping and pounding about the head and shoulders. He folded up his stuff and disappeared, and I never saw him again.
In July 1953, the war ended. After the ceasefire, 15 Sabre pilots were repatriated. Mike DeArmond and Bud Mahurin were among them. But Troy Cope, John Baldwin, and 31 others were not returned home. For 40 years, Western intelligence believed that some missing servicemen could be in Soviet hands. But during the Cold War years, this was impossible to confirm.
It was something that the American public was not aware of. It was not publicized. Why? We didn't want to have World War III with the Soviet Union. We were content to let this little charade play itself out.
In 1992, the Russian President Boris Yeltsin made a startling speech to the US Congress, which rekindled suspicions that there might be some truth in the rumors.
Even if one American has been detained in my country and can still be found, I will find him. I will get him back to his family.
For the first time, a Russian premier promised that if they held missing Americans, they would send them home. His speech gave renewed hope to the relatives of missing pilots.
It's the same markings as from Korea.
Yeah. The difference here is...
Among them is Anne Backenson, who is coming face to face with the same type of plane her dad flew.
I'm just amazed. I mean, the markings on the plane are the same, the yellow and black, and how many times have I looked at pictures of that and thought about my dad.
Anne Backenson's father, Lieutenant Robert Neiman, was shot down 3 months before the end of the Korean War. She never believed he died in combat, and for her, Yeltsin's speech seemed to confirm this.
I naturally assumed that he had been taken to the Soviet Union and had lived out his time there. Our government is more cautious about making any type of conclusion, and so I want to believe that he was captured and was alive, because that gives me hope that he might still be alive.
With the collapse of communism, it was hoped that new information on the missing pilots might emerge from the former Soviet Union. Dan's Blasser received documents from Russia's newly opened archives that referred to American pilots. Among those named was Anne's father, Robert Neiman.
One of the documents we received was what we call the List of 59, and it's a list of Americans who, as the document states, transited through a interrogation point. It was a contemporary document written up by some Russian researchers in the early 90s. One of the names on this document was Captain Robert Neiman. Captain Neiman is still missing. We have never recovered his body from the Korean War. So our problem was, how do you justify he never came home with he transited through an interrogation point?
Many of the answers everyone hoped would emerge from Russia have not materialized. The information Anne has received is ambiguous or incomplete.
It's really difficult to try to be realistic and reasonable about this when you don't have the information. Every time you think something happened, it means you have to adjust your thinking to that, and then information will come along that says something else. I mean, what if his plane went down and burst into flames and he was burned beyond recognition, and someday I see a photograph of him as just a few pieces of singed flesh and some equipment on the ground? Well, that would be hard to deal with too, but any outcome would be hard to deal with. So I I guess I've tried not to make a definite conclusion, but you always hope.
For the Russians, debriefing a Sabre pilot like Robert Niemann could provide critical intelligence. They were keen to know the secrets of the Sabre. The pilots might reveal some information, but what the Russians also needed was to capture the plane itself.
We wanted to capture a Sabre, and they wanted to capture a MiG. That's quite natural. Descriptions can be inaccurate due to translation and decoding. It's much better to see with your own eyes and to touch with your own hands.
Soviet pilots were under orders to bring down a Sabre without destroying it. This was easier said than done, but one day they got the chance they'd been waiting for. Yevgeny Pepelayev was the top gun of the Korean War, with 23 kills to his name.
The squadron took off to intercept the enemy fighters. I decided to use my tried and tested maneuver. I made it look like I was drifting to the left, then immediately moved right. I had almost drawn level with the Sabre, so I rolled my aircraft and took aim. I didn't bother to follow him once he went down.
The Sabre pilot managed to land the plane without it exploding. The plane buried itself in the sand. The pilot was saved by a rescue team, and the plane was left behind.
As the pilot fled to safety, a new battle erupted around his downed Sabre.
The Americans tried to destroy it, to prevent us taking it, but they failed.
One of America's worst fears had been realized. Their top fighter had fallen into Soviet hands. For the Russians, it was the chance they'd been waiting for. Now they could send the Sabre back to Moscow to investigate its top-secret technology.
Of course, it was great to get such a prize. We sent it to Moscow straight away.
There it remained, hidden behind the Iron Curtain. One of the original members of the top-secret team that studied the captured Sabre still lives in a Russian Air Force housing complex just outside Moscow. Vadim Matkeyevich's job was to evaluate and adapt captured technology for use on Soviet aircraft. He was able to learn a lot from the captured Sabre.
All the equipment was stripped off the aircraft, including the electronic gun sight. It was sent to our institute in Chkalovskaya. I was given the task of studying the Sabre's electronic gun sight, its design, how it worked, its performance. I wrote a report explaining its exceptional qualities compared with the equipment on Soviet aircraft.
The Soviet Union, Cold War enemy of the United States, had learned the innermost secrets of America's top fighter.
I explained that all the gun sight data was projected onto the forward windscreen. The range and target was automatically encircled. It was absolutely outstanding.
The Soviet Union wanted to adapt their MiGs and develop countermeasures against this captured technology. But to achieve this, they needed to interrogate Sabre pilots.
We needed American pilots. The reason we needed them was so they could explain and demonstrate to us all the plane systems, how they work and what everything does, that kind of thing.
Just how many missing pilots were taken to the Soviet Union remains a mystery. But for some families, the search is over. They will now have to come to terms with the truth. Danny Cope's father, Troy, disappeared during a dogfight on the 16th of September, 1952. Search and rescue teams could find no trace of a crash site. His family had no idea what had happened to him. 40 years later, Dans Blasser made a major breakthrough in his quest to discover Cope's fate. He found a description of a saber shootdown that matched the date of Troy Cope's disappearance. This document from the Soviet archives said the plane crashed over the North Korean border in China.
It said that it crashed into the house of Li Jiangcheng in the 8th district of Andun. Well, it was like Eureka. We went there, we did a site survey, we found evidence that there was a plane crash in that location. They discovered high concentrations of hydrocarbons, which indicated jet fuel, and some pieces of aircraft wreckage.
At the crash site, they had found a number of things that belonged to my father. They found a sole of a shoe that actually compared it to the American issue of boot at that time, and it matched the size of my dad's shoe. They'd found a watch band and a watch back, and then the picture of Rosie, of which you can see the watch in it, and it's that watch. A pocket knife that was totally rusted. There was pieces of the map that he'd used of Korea, and then pieces of a magazine that he was reading at the time.
The recovery team also found human remains at the crash site. They were taken to a government lab for DNA analysis. This confirmed beyond doubt that Troy Cope had been found.
We actually went into the lab to where my dad's stuff was laid out. A small pile of fragments of bones. Being with the remains and being able to touch them, and that was just beyond words. Can't describe it. So.
Michael Baldwin has heard of Dans Blasser's success in finding Captain Cope. Michael hopes that Dans may have come across some reference to his father whilst working in the Russian archives.
Mr. Baldwin. Hello. Hi. Come on in, please. Nice to meet you, Dans Blasser. Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, I really enjoy meeting the family members, and you're one of our family members. Yeah. Okay. Your father died while he was serving with the U.S. Air Force. Yeah. And we owe you, as his son, any kind of answers we can find.
Yeah, I'm glad. That'll be great.
Okay, back in 1994, we did an interview of a retired Soviet officer who was in the intelligence branch at the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps. And in this interview, he gave a lot of information that checked out. In addition, he gave this little statement here about 3 Canadian aircraft being shot down in Korea. But he says here that he recalled one of the pilots was a Colonel Baldwin or Baldwin, and he died in the crash, and he did not know what happened to the other 2 pilots. And that's what led to this document being put into the file for your father. Right? Yeah. There are no other Baldwins, Americans or Canadians missing of that rank or equivalent rank.
If this account is true, and his father did die in this crash, the site lies deep in North Korea. For now, this staunchly communist country remains closed to outsiders. Michael's hopes that his father survived are slowly fading.
The most painful thing, I would suppose, that he died in really painful circumstances. Whether that was a crash, you sort of half expect that may be the truth. And it will be shocking if it does come, but you still want to know the truth. You'd much rather know the truth than some fairy story.
As I look back on it now and all the events that led up to where we are today, I just have a real sense of well-being that made that trip, as emotional and difficult as it was, worth it.
53 years after he crashed near the North Korean border, Danny's father, Captain Troy Cope, was buried with full military honors in Dallas-Fort Worth National Cemetery in Texas.
We've only looked at approximately a quarter of the documents that we know to exist on the Soviet involvement during the Korean War. Do I expect that we can solve some more of these cases? I do.
I hope that other families get to have the end experience that I do, and that they don't go through their entire lives never knowing, because I think that's the most difficult part, is not knowing.
If you have a loved one that dies, you will never stop thinking about that loved one. And for my dad, it's a loved one that I never knew, so besides the fact that he's gone and I still think about him, I still wonder what he's like.
For one family, it's the end of a long road. But for others, the search goes on.
This last few days has given me renewed optimism that there will be an answer. It may be a very simple one, that he died in the crash. It may be that he was a prisoner of war. The possibilities are still endless, but I'm absolutely sure that there will be a conclusion to this somehow or other. It may take 4, 5, 10 years, but I won't be happy until I find it. But I will find it.